Some endings do not feel like endings at first. They feel like confusion, like distance, like waking up one morning and realizing something that used to feel alive inside you has gone quiet, not broken, not destroyed, just unreachable. And maybe that is why beginning again feels so difficult. Because nobody tells you when something truly ends. There is no sound for it, no visible line. Most of the time, the ending happens internally first, silently. A person continues smiling after they have already disappeared from their own life. A relationship continues speaking after the connection has already left the room. A dream continues existing on paper long after belief has stopped living inside it. And the terrifying part is sometimes you do not notice until much later, until one ordinary moment suddenly reveals it. You are sitting somewhere familiar, hearing people laugh, watching the world continue normally, and something inside you asks a question so quietly you almost miss it. When was the last time I actually felt present in my own life? That question changes people, because once it appears, you cannot fully return to sleep afterward. You begin noticing things, how automatic your routines became, how much of your life is now maintenance instead of participation, how many decisions are made from exhaustion instead of desire, how often you say maybe later to things you secretly miss, and slowly, another realization appears underneath all of it. You are no longer measuring time by growth. You are measuring it by endings, before the breakup, after the failure, before the loss, after the disappointment. That becomes the calendar. And when time is measured that way, beginning again starts feeling impossible. Because every future moment gets compared to what disappeared. Every possibility passes through memory first. The mind asks, what if this ends too? And eventually, without meaning to, you stop beginning. Not completely, just internally. You still move, still work, still answer messages, still exist inside the structure of a life. But existence and aliveness are not the same thing. One is survival, the other is participation. Most people discover that difference far later than they expected. There are people walking around right now whose lives ended emotionally years ago, and nobody knows. Not even the people closest to them. Because humans are incredibly skilled at continuing externally after something has collapsed internally. That is what survival is. The body adapts. The routines continue. The personality learns how to function around the wound. But adaptation is not healing. Sometimes adaptation is only prolonged distance from yourself. And distance becomes dangerous when it lasts too long, because eventually the disconnected version of you starts feeling normal. You stop questioning the numbness. You call it maturity. You call it realism. You call it being careful. But deep down, something knows the difference. Something remembers what it felt like to be fully involved in life. To want things without fear immediately interrupting the desire. To enter moments without already imagining their ending. To love without preparing for disappearance at the same time. Children do this naturally. They participate completely. That is why childhood memories feel so alive. Not because childhood was perfect, because presence was still intact. Then life happens, loss happens, embarrassment happens, failure happens, and slowly the mind learns protection, not all at once, in layers. One disappointment teaches hesitation, one betrayal teaches distance, one humiliation teaches self-consciousness, until eventually the person who once moved naturally through life becomes someone constantly managing risk internally. That changes time itself, because protection slows life down, not externally, internally. The person is still living, but no longer arriving fully where they are. And maybe this is why some endings stay alive for years. Not because the event itself was too powerful, because the ending interrupted participation. Something closed afterward, something withdrew, and life continued around the withdrawal. Think about how many people are still emotionally living inside old conversations, still trying to prove themselves to people who are no longer there, still carrying shame from moments everyone else forgot, still organizing their lives around endings that already happened. That is not weakness. That is unresolved meaning. The human mind revisits endings because it wants understanding, not repetition, understanding. Because pain without meaning freezes time. The nervous system keeps returning to the place where something broke and asks, "What was this trying to teach me?" And if no answer comes, the ending stays active, not in memory, in identity. That is where people get trapped. Not in the event itself, in the version of themselves created afterward. I am someone who gets abandoned. I am someone who ruins things. I am someone life does not work for. Those sentences become structure, and structure is dangerous because eventually it feels true. Not because it is true, because repetition creates familiarity, and the mind confuses familiarity with truth constantly. There is a strange comfort in hopelessness. People rarely admit this, but hopelessness removes responsibility. If nothing can change, then nothing needs to be risked anymore. No vulnerability, no effort, no uncertainty. Just survival. But survival eventually becomes unbearable when a person remembers they were built for more than endurance. That is when the real crisis begins. Not when life collapses, when numbness stops working, when the distractions fail, when the routines no longer cover the silence underneath them. And suddenly the person realizes, I have spent years protecting myself from pain and accidentally protected myself from life too. That realization hurts because it exposes something difficult. Avoiding endings has a cost. You avoid love to avoid heartbreak. You avoid risk to avoid failure. You avoid honesty to avoid rejection. But what disappears with the pain is not only pain, it is aliveness itself. The person becomes safe but internally absent, and absence is exhausting, even when nobody else sees it, especially then. So how does a person begin again after that? Not through motivation. Motivation is unstable, not through confidence either. Confidence usually comes after movement, not before it. Beginning again starts differently, much quieter than people expect. It begins with honesty, one honest moment. One moment where the person stops pretending they are still connected to a life they emotionally left years ago. That moment matters more than any plan, because truth changes direction. Not immediately, but structurally. The moment you admit, This version of me is no longer alive. Something starts moving underneath the numbness. Not certainty, movement. And movement matters more than certainty. People think they need clarity before they begin again, but clarity is often created by movement itself. You walk first. Understanding arrives later. That is how almost every real transformation happens, not through revelation, through participation before proof. This is where most people stop, right here, at the invisible stage, because beginning again feels empty at first. There are no guarantees, no signs, no immediate evidence the movement matters, and humans want visible progress. The mind wants reassurance. It wants to know. Will this work? Will this pain mean something? Will I lose again? But life almost never answers those questions in advance, especially not the important ones. Some paths only become visible while walking them, which means uncertainty is not a mistake. It is part of the structure. And maybe the reason the future feels invisible right now is not because your life is over. Maybe it is because you reached the edge of the old identity and the new one has not fully formed yet. That space feels terrifying because the mind interprets unfamiliarity as danger. Even when the unfamiliar thing is freedom, especially then. People stay inside old suffering because suffering at least feels known, predictable, but openness. Openness feels like standing somewhere with no map, no guarantees, no proof, only possibility. And possibility is frightening after disappointment, because disappointment teaches caution very quickly. But listen carefully. The goal is not becoming fearless again. Fearlessness is mostly performance. The goal is becoming willing again, willing to participate, willing to care, willing to begin without certainty. That is courage, not the absence of fear, movement despite it. And maybe this changes the entire question. Maybe the question is not, how do I begin again after endings? Maybe the question is, how long am I willing to remain emotionally absent from my own life? Because eventually that becomes the real pain, not what ended, what never restarted afterward. Years pass either way. Time moves either way. The only difference is whether you move with it or remain emotionally frozen beside something that already disappeared. There is another truth hidden inside endings, something most people miss. Endings reveal attachment, not only to people, to identities, versions of yourself, ideas about how life was supposed to unfold. Sometimes the thing grieving is not the loss itself. It is the collapse of certainty, the realization that life can change direction without permission. That realization destabilizes people deeply, because humans build emotional security through prediction. We believe, this person will stay, this dream will happen, this version of my life is permanent. Then reality changes, and suddenly the mind no longer trusts the future. That is why beginning again feels dangerous. Not because the future is impossible, because trust disappeared. And trust is difficult to rebuild once endings become the primary way you measure time. But trust does return, slowly, not through thinking, through experience. You survive something, then survive something else. Then one day realize, I have ended many times before and still continued. That realization creates a different relationship with endings. They stop feeling like total destruction and start feeling more like transformation without immediate explanation. Painful, confusing, but survivable. Maybe that is what growth actually is. Not becoming untouched, not becoming invulnerable, becoming someone who can experience endings without abandoning themselves afterward. That changes everything, because some people lose one thing and close forever. Others lose many things and somehow remain open. The difference is not strength, it is interpretation. One person decides, this proves life is unsafe. Another decides, this proves I was alive enough to care deeply. Same pain, different meaning, different future, and meaning shapes time. If endings only mean loss, life becomes smaller after every disappointment. But if endings also mean participation, then even grief becomes evidence that something real happened there. Something mattered. Something reached you fully. One day. Without realizing exactly when it happened, you will notice a small return of yourself. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just subtle. You laugh naturally for a second. You become curious about something again. You look forward to a future moment without immediately imagining its ending. And maybe that is how beginning again actually happens. Not all at once, not through one decision, through tiny acts of re-entering life repeatedly. A conversation, a risk, a moment of honesty, a willingness to stop organizing your entire existence around what disappeared. And eventually, the future begins feeling possible again. Not guaranteed, possible. That is enough, more than enough. Because life was never asking for certainty, only participation. So if time has been measured by endings for a long time now, maybe beginning again starts here, not by forgetting what ended, not by pretending it did not change you, but by refusing to let the ending become the final definition of who you are. Because there is a difference between something ending and you ending with it. And maybe that difference is where the next version of your life quietly begins.